15th August 778. One road, one pass. An army stretched for miles through the Pyrenees, and the men at the very back had no idea they were already dead. Charlemagne's rearguard wasn't just protecting soldiers. They were guarding the treasure, the hostages, the proof of everything the campaign had won. And somewhere above them, hidden in the trees and rocks, local warriors watched and waited for the perfect moment to strike. What happened next would haunt a dynasty, and centuries later, it would become one of the most famous battle stories ever told, except almost none of it would be true. This is the real story of Roncesvalles. Let's rewind. Because to understand why elite Frankish warriors died in a mountain pass, you need to understand what brought them there in the first place. Spring 778. Charlemagne is 35 years old. He's already conquered half of Europe. The Saxons fear him. The Lombards bow to him. His kingdom stretches from the Atlantic to the edges of Bavaria. But there's a problem to the south. Spain. Or, more precisely, the chaos in Spain. The Iberian Peninsula is fractured. Muslim emirs fight each other for control, and one of them, a governor named Suleiman al-Arabi, sends messengers north with an offer that seems too good to refuse. "Help me against my enemies," he promises, "and I'll give you cities, Zaragoza, Barcelona, a foothold south of the Pyrenees." Charlemagne listens. Now, here's what you need to understand about Charlemagne. This isn't just a king. This is a man who believes, truly believes, that God has chosen him to expand Christian dominion. Every conquest is holy. Every war is righteous. And Spain? Spain was Christian once. The Visigoths ruled there before the Muslim conquest just 60 years earlier. Taking it back wouldn't just be strategic, it would be divine. So Charlemagne assembles the largest army he's ever commanded. We don't know exact numbers. Medieval chroniclers exaggerate wildly, but this is the full might of the Frankish kingdom: cavalry, infantry, siege engineers, supply wagons stretching for miles, and at the head of it all, the king himself. 2 columns cross the Pyrenees through different passes. They converge on the target, Zaragoza. And that's when everything starts to fall apart. Suleiman al-Arabi's promises? Empty. When Charlemagne arrives at Zaragoza, the gates are closed. The city won't surrender. The local Muslim rulers have reconciled their differences. Funny how a massive Frankish army crossing your mountains can make former enemies into sudden friends. There will be no easy handover. No grateful cities welcoming their Christian liberator. Charlemagne has marched his entire army across one of Europe's most brutal mountain ranges. For nothing. But wait. It gets worse. Word arrives from the north. The Saxons, those same Saxons Charlemagne thought he'd beaten into submission, have revolted. Again. They're burning churches, killing priests, threatening everything he's built. Charlemagne faces an impossible choice. Stay in Spain and try to salvage something from this disaster? Or abandon the campaign and race home before his empire unravels? He chooses home, but he won't leave empty-handed. On the way back north, his army stops at Pamplona. The city is controlled by Basques, nominally Christian, technically independent, strategically vital. Charlemagne demands their submission. When it isn't enthusiastic enough, he tears down their walls. Remember this, because what happens next isn't random. It isn't bandits getting lucky, it's revenge. And the Basques have long memories. Now picture the retreat. August, high summer, but in the Pyrenees, the nights are cold and the passes are narrow. Charlemagne's army, thousands of men, hundreds of wagons, countless horses, must squeeze through gaps in the mountains designed for goat paths, not imperial columns. The road to Francia runs through the pass of Roncesvalles. Or maybe the pass of Ibaneta just above it. Historians still argue. What matters is this: roughly 1 to 100 meters above sea level, a saddle between peaks where the path narrows to almost nothing. Single file, think about that. An army that conquered Europe, forced to walk single file. The vanguard goes first. Then the main body, Charlemagne himself, his household troops, the bulk of his cavalry. The column stretches back for miles. You couldn't see the front from the back. You couldn't hear orders pass down the line. If something happened at the rear, the head of the army wouldn't know for hours. And at the very back, protecting the baggage train, the slowest and most vulnerable part of any medieval army. The rearguard. Who were these men? Not peasant conscripts, not second-rate soldiers given the boring job. These were elite warriors, the best Charlemagne had. We know 3 names. Only 3 out of however many died that day. And the fact that we know them tells you everything about how important they were. Roland. Prefect of the Breton March, a frontier commander, which means he'd spent his career fighting in the most dangerous territory the Franks controlled. You don't get that job by being cautious. You get it by being exceptional. Egihard, the king's seneschal, his chief steward, responsible for the royal household. One of the most trusted men in Charlemagne's inner circle. Anselm, Count of the Palace, another intimate of the king, another man who should have been untouchable. These weren't expendable officers. These were Charlemagne's friends, his best commanders, his inner circle. Why were they at the back? Because the back is where you put the men you trust most. The rearguard doesn't just protect stragglers. It protects everything the army can't afford to lose. The baggage wagons, the treasury, the hostages taken during the campaign, political leverage worth more than gold. If the rearguard fails, the army doesn't just lose supplies. It loses prestige. It loses proof of victory. It loses face. So Charlemagne put his best men there, his most trusted, his most skilled. And then he marched away, up the mountain, and left them behind. Now shift perspective. You're a Basque warrior. Your home is these mountains. You've walked these paths since childhood. You know every rock, every tree, every hidden fold in the terrain where 10 men can hide unseen. A few months ago, Frankish soldiers destroyed your city's walls, humiliated your leaders, treated your people like conquered subjects even though you've never sworn allegiance to any foreign king. And now those same Franks are retreating, running home with their tails between their legs, their grand campaign of failure, their king already miles ahead, out of reach. But the baggage train? That's right there, crawling up the mountain, loaded with everything valuable the Franks are taking home, guarded by men in heavy armor, riding heavy horses, trained to fight on open ground. These mountains aren't open ground. The terrain at Roncesvalles is a death trap, if you know how to use it. Steep slopes covered in forest, boulders the size of houses, ravines that drop away without warning. A modern soldier would call it channelized terrain. There's only one way through, and that way is a killing floor. Frankish cavalry was the most feared military force in Europe. On a flat battlefield, they were unstoppable. A wall of armored men on armored horses, hitting an enemy line like a battering ram. No infantry could stand against them. No light cavalry could match them. But put those same men on a narrow mountain path, surrounded by slopes too steep to climb, unable to form lines, unable to charge, unable to even turn around. Their greatest strength becomes their death sentence. Heavy armor doesn't help you when you're scrambling over rocks. War horses aren't nimble on loose scree. Shields don't protect you from enemies throwing javelins from above, from positions you can't even reach. The Basques knew this. They'd lived it their entire lives. They'd watched Roman legions march through these same passes centuries before. They knew how to make mountains into weapons. And on August 15th, 778, they were watching. Waiting. hidden in the trees above the pass, invisible to the armored men crawling along the road below. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it. Late afternoon, the shadows are lengthening in the pass. Charlemagne and the vanguard have already crested the summit. They're descending the northern slopes, heading toward Francia, toward home. The king is probably thinking about the Saxons, about the campaign he needs to fight next, about salvaging something from this Spanish disaster. He's not thinking about the men behind him. Miles back, the rearguard is still climbing. The baggage wagons slow everything down. Wheels catch on rocks. Horses stumble. Drivers curse. The column bunches up, stretches out, bunches up again. It's exhausting, tedious work. The kind of march where your mind wanders, where your eyes stop scanning the tree line because you've seen nothing but trees for hours. That's when they come. No warning, no horns, no battle cries, just a sudden rain of javelins from above. The first men die before they understand what's happening. One moment they're trudging forward, armor clanking, minds elsewhere. The next moment there's a spear in their throat and they're falling. Then the screaming starts. Picture it. You're a Frankish soldier in the middle of the rearguard column. You hear shouts from behind. You turn, but the path is too narrow. You can barely see past the men in front of you. Someone yells, "Ambush!" But where? How many? From which direction? Javelins keep falling. Men are dying, and you can't see who's killing them. This is the nightmare of mountain warfare. Your enemy owns the high ground, and the high ground is everywhere. They're above you to the left, above you to the right, hidden in the rocks, hidden in the trees, popping up to throw a spear, and then vanishing before you can react. And you're trapped on a path barely wide enough for two horses side by side. The Basques weren't stupid. They didn't attack the whole column. They didn't need to. Think about it. If you hit the middle of a marching army, the front and back can both respond. They can wheel around, coordinate, catch you in a pincer. But if you hit the very end, the front doesn't even know it's happening. The rearguard was cut off from the moment the first javelin flew. Miles of mountain terrain between them and rescue. Hours before any messenger could reach Charlemagne, and hours more before help could march back up the pass. They were alone, and the Basques had all the time in the world. Here's what heavy armor does to you in a mountain ambush. It slows you down. You're carrying 50, 60 pounds of metal and leather. On flat ground, that's manageable. On a rocky slope, every step is a struggle. Every stumble could mean a fall. And if you fall, you might not get up again before someone puts a blade in you. It limits your vision. Helmets protect your skull, but they also create blind spots. You can't see what's above you. You can't track fast-moving enemies darting between rocks. It makes you loud. Chainmail jingles, plate clanks. You announce your position with every movement. Meanwhile, your enemies wear leather and wool. They're ghosts, and worst of all, it marks you as valuable. The Basques weren't just fighting for revenge. They wanted plunder. And the man in the finest armor, the officer on the best horse, he's either worth killing for his equipment or worth capturing for ransom. Either way, he's a target. Roland, Egihard, Anselm. The three named dead. They probably stood out, wore the best gear, rode at the center of the formation, tried to rally their men, to organize resistance. They might as well have painted targets on their chests. Now here's the question that haunts this battle. Why didn't the rearguard retreat? They're being slaughtered. They're outmatched in terrain they don't understand against enemies they can't see. The rational choice, the smart choice, would be to abandon the baggage train and run. Fall back up the pass, rejoin the main army, live to fight another day. But they didn't run. Why? Some historians say they couldn't. The path behind them was already blocked, either by Basque fighters cutting off escape, or by the chaos of fallen men and panicked horses clogging the narrow road. Maybe. But I don't think that's the whole answer. Because here's the thing about rearguards, about the men chosen for that duty. They know that their job isn't to win. Their job is to buy time, to absorb the blow that would otherwise hit the main army, to die, if necessary, so that others can live. Roland was a frontier commander. He'd spent his career in the Breton March, fighting Bretons, Basques, whoever threatened the borders. He understood sacrifice. He understood what it meant to hold a line. And if the rearguard broke, if they scattered and ran, the Basques wouldn't stop. They'd roll forward into the baggage train, then into the stragglers, then into the main column. Panic would spread. Men would trample each other trying to escape on paths too narrow for flight. One rearguard breaking could turn a lost skirmish into a catastrophic rout. Roland didn't let that happen. We don't know how long the battle lasted. An hour? 2. The sun was setting. Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer, makes that clear. The light was dying, and so were the Franks. But they held. They held in impossible conditions, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, outmatched in every way that mattered. They couldn't charge, no room. They couldn't form a shield wall, the terrain wouldn't allow it. They couldn't retreat, the path was chaos. All they could do was stand, and fight, and die, one by one, man by man, buying minutes with their blood. Picture Roland in those final moments. He's wounded. He must be. Everyone around him is wounded or dead. His horse is probably gone, killed beneath him or abandoned when the terrain made riding impossible. He's fighting on foot now, sword in hand, in armor that weighs more than he can bear. And he knows. He knows no rescue is coming. He knows the sun is setting. He knows this is the end. But the main army is safe. Charlemagne is safe. The retreat continues. The math works out. The Basques didn't need to kill everyone. They just needed to win. As darkness fell, the rearguard collapsed. The survivors, if there were any, melted into the chaos. The baggage train was overrun, wagons looted, horses taken. Treasure that had traveled all the way from Zaragoza now vanished into the mountains, into Basque hands, gone forever. And then, the attackers disappeared. This is the part that made Charlemagne's failure complete. In any normal battle, the loser retreats and the victor pursues, or the loser regroups and counterattacks. There's a second act, a chance for revenge, or at least clarity. But the Basques didn't stick around to be counterattacked. They didn't occupy the pass or demand terms. They grabbed what they wanted and scattered into mountains they knew better than any Frank ever could. By the time Charlemagne learned what had happened, by the time messengers reached him with news of the disaster, there was no enemy left to fight, no army to chase, no city to besiege, just empty mountains and the bodies of his best men. The rearguard was annihilated. Let that word sink in. Annihilated, not defeated, not routed, destroyed so completely that no organized force remained. Roland was dead. Egihard was dead. Anselm was dead. Every man who'd stood with them, dead or scattered into the darkness, never to be seen again. The baggage train was gone. The treasury, the hostages, the proof of everything the Spanish campaign had achieved, all of it lost. And Charlemagne? Charlemagne kept marching north. Because what else could he do? The Saxons were revolting. His empire needed him. He couldn't spend weeks hunting mountain guerrillas through terrain that would only kill more of his men. He had to leave his dead behind, unburied, unavenged. That night, somewhere on the northern slopes of the Pyrenees, Charlemagne must have understood the truth. He'd lost. Not the campaign. That was already a failure before Roncesvalles. He'd lost something worse. He'd lost men he couldn't replace, friends, brothers in arms, the inner circle that had helped him build an empire. And he'd lost them for nothing, for a retreat from a war that should never have been fought. for a gamble on Spanish promises that turned to ash. The greatest conqueror in European history, humiliated by mountain farmers. There would be no songs celebrating this, no chronicles boasting of Frankish valor. For decades, the official records would stay almost silent about what happened in that pass. Almost silent, but not forever. Here's the brutal math of what happened at Roncesvalles. The rearguard died. The army survived. That's not poetry. That's not legend. That's the cold calculation of military sacrifice, the equation that every commander understands but rarely speaks aloud. Someone has to be last. Someone has to absorb the blow. Someone has to stand in the gap while everyone else escapes. At Roncesvalles, Roland and his men were that someone. Think about the alternative. Think about what happens if the rearguard doesn't hold. The Basques attack the tail of the column. The rearguard panics, breaks, runs. They flee up the pass, crashing into the baggage train. Wagons overturn, horses rear, drivers abandon their carts and flee on foot. Now there's chaos in the middle of the column. Men who were marching peacefully suddenly see refugees streaming toward them, screaming about ambush. They don't know what's happening. They don't know how many enemies there are. They just know that something terrible is coming from behind. Panic spreads forward, like fire, like plague. The road is narrow, there's nowhere to go. Men start pushing, shoving, climbing over each other. Horses trample soldiers. Soldiers trample each other. The column compresses, jams, stops completely. And the Basques keep coming. They roll through the broken rearguard, through the abandoned baggage, into the packed mass of terrified men who can't advance, can't retreat, can't fight, can't do anything except die. This is how armies are destroyed, not by superior force, but by cascading failure. One break leads to another, then another, until the whole structure collapses. If that had happened at Roncesvalles, if the panic had reached the main army, Charlemagne himself might have died in that pass. The Frankish Empire might have ended right there, in a mountain massacre, because one rearguard couldn't hold. But they held. The men who died at Roncesvalles weren't just soldiers. They were a firebreak. They absorbed the Basque assault the way a dam absorbs a flood. They took the full force of the attack, all the javelins, all the fury, all the violence, and they kept it from spreading forward. By the time the rearguard collapsed, the main army was miles away. Safe. Unaware that anything had happened until messengers arrived hours later. Roland didn't save himself. He saved everyone else. We need to talk about what we actually know, because here's the uncomfortable truth. Almost nothing. The Battle of Roncesvalles is one of the most famous military disasters in medieval history. It inspired the greatest epic poem of the Middle Ages. It's been analyzed by historians for over 1,000 years, and our primary source is one paragraph. Einhard, Charlemagne's biographer, wrote about Roncesvalles roughly 50 years after it happened. His account is brief, almost reluctant, like he's recording something shameful that can't be ignored but shouldn't be dwelt upon. Here's what he tells us. The Basques attacked the rearguard. The terrain favored the attackers. The Franks were massacred. The baggage was plundered. The attackers escaped. 3 names: Egihard, Anselm, Roland. That's it. No numbers. No detailed tactics. No hero's last stand. Just a terse admission that something terrible happened, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The silence speaks louder than words. Think about what's missing from Einhard's account. No casualty figures. Medieval chroniclers loved numbers, usually exaggerated, always dramatic. 10,000 Saxons fell. 100,000 Saracens. But for Roncesvalles, nothing. Either Einhard didn't know how many died, or the number was too embarrassing to record. No enemy description. The attackers are just Basques or Gascons, local mountain people, not a proper army, not a worthy foe, just farmers, bandits, nobodies. The implication is clear. The mighty Franks weren't defeated by a real enemy. They were ambushed by peasants. No, heroic details. Roland doesn't make a famous last stand in Einhard's version. He doesn't blow a horn, doesn't refuse to call for help, doesn't die cradling his sword. He's just listed. One name among three. Dead. This is what defeat looks like when you can't spin it as victory. When there's no silver lining, no lesson learned, no glorious sacrifice to celebrate, just loss. Pure and total. Why did Charlemagne leave the pass without pursuing the attackers? This question has bothered historians for centuries. The greatest military commander of his age, with the largest army in Europe at his back, and he just walked away? Part of the answer is practical. The Basques had vanished. You can't fight an enemy you can't find. And sending Frankish cavalry into those mountains to hunt guerrillas would just create more ambushes, more dead, more humiliation. But there's another answer. A harder one. Charlemagne couldn't afford to stay. The Saxons were revolting. His northern border was on fire. Every day he spent in the Pyrenees was a day his enemies grew stronger, a day his empire grew weaker. He had to choose, avenge the dead or protect the living. He chose the living. And that choice, that brutal, necessary, heartbreaking choice, meant leaving Roland's body in the mountains, leaving the rearguard unburied, leaving the defeat unavenged. No wonder Einhard's account is so terse. What else could he say? The wound of Roncesvalles never healed. Not really. Charlemagne went on to greater conquests. He crushed the Saxon revolt. He expanded his empire until it covered most of Western Europe. In 800, the Pope crowned him emperor, the first in the West since Rome fell. But he never went back to Spain. Not personally, not in force. Oh, the Franks eventually conquered territory south of the Pyrenees. They established the Spanish March, a buffer zone that would evolve into Catalonia. But the dream of taking Zaragoza, of liberating Iberia, of finishing what 778 started, gone, abandoned, too costly to pursue. One ambush, one afternoon, one pass. That's all it took to reshape Charlemagne's ambitions. And Roland? Roland became a ghost, a name in a chronicle, 3 syllables in a list of the dead. For 200 years, that's all he was. No songs, no legends, no epic poems, just a prefect of the Breton March who died in a mountain pass during a failed campaign. History forgot him. But memory works in strange ways. And sometimes, the stories we don't tell become more powerful than the ones we do. Somewhere in the decades after Roncesvalles, whispers started. Soldiers' tales passed from campfire to campfire. Did you hear about the rearguard? About the men who held the pass? About the commander who refused to call for help because he was too proud, too brave, too stubborn to admit defeat? The whispers grew, and grew, and grew, until 3 centuries later, Roland wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a legend. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the legend, there was the silence, the shame, the empty space where a victory should have been. Charlemagne returned to Francia in the autumn of 778. He never spoke publicly about what happened at Roncesvalles, neither did his court. The official narrative focused on the Saxon campaigns, on victories, on expansion. Spain was a footnote, a detour, a mistake best forgotten. But forgetting isn't the same as healing. And somewhere in the mountains, in Basque villages and Gascon homesteads, a different story was being told. A story of triumph, of the day the mountain people humbled an empire, of treasure won and revenge taken and foreign invaders sent running home. 2 narratives, 2 truths, and 300 years of silence before anyone tried to reconcile them. The dead stayed dead, the pass stayed empty, the empire moved on. But the story? The story was just beginning. 300 years. That's how long it took for Roland to rise from the dead. In 778, he was a name in a list. A frontier commander who died in an ambush. By 1100, he was the greatest hero in European literature. A warrior of impossible courage. A martyr who chose death over dishonor. What happened? The Song of Roland happened. Sometime around 1100, maybe a little earlier, maybe a little later, a poet whose name we'll never know composed an epic. We call it the Chanson de Roland, the Song of Roland. And it changed everything. The poem is magnificent. Nearly 4,000 lines of old French verse, telling the story of Charlemagne's Spanish campaign, the betrayal of the rearguard, and Roland's last stand at Roncesvalles. It's also almost completely fictional. But here's the thing about fiction. Sometimes it tells a truer truth than history ever could. And sometimes it buries history so deep that no one remembers what actually happened. The Song of Roland did both. Let's talk about what the poem changed. First, the enemy. In history, the attackers were Basques, local mountain people, Christians, technically, at least nominally. They weren't holy warriors or foreign invaders. They were neighbors with a grudge. In the poem, Saracens, Muslims, a vast army of 400,000 warriors, an absurd number, impossible, clearly invented, led by a pagan king named Marsilet, who rules all of Spain. Why the change? Because by 1100, Europe was obsessed with crusade. The First Crusade had just captured Jerusalem. Christian knights were dying in the Holy Land, fighting for God against Islam. A story about Frankish heroes dying at Muslim hands fit the mood perfectly. A story about Frankish heroes dying to angry Basque farmers? Less inspiring. So the poet rewrote history. The Basques vanished. The Saracens appeared. And suddenly Roncesvalles wasn't a military blunder. It was a holy martyrdom. Second change, the betrayal. In history, there's no evidence of treachery. The Basques attacked because Charlemagne had destroyed their walls. It was revenge, straightforward and brutal. In the poem? A villain named Ganelon, Roland's own stepfather, sells out the rearguard to the Saracens. He tells them exactly when to attack, exactly where to strike, exactly how to catch Roland alone and vulnerable. The ambush becomes a conspiracy. Roland doesn't die because of bad luck or bad terrain. He dies because someone he trusted put a knife in his back. Why add this? Because betrayal makes a better story. Because it gives the audience someone to hate. Because it transforms a chaotic ambush into a tidy narrative with heroes and villains, good and evil, loyalty and treachery. History is messy. Legend is clean. Third change, Roland himself. In Einhard's account, Roland is just a name. We know nothing about his personality, his choices, his final moments. In the poem, Roland becomes a character. And what a character. He's proud, fierce, stubborn to the point of madness. When the Saracen army appears, his friend Oliver begs him to blow his horn, the Oliphant, and summon Charlemagne back to help. Roland refuses. It would be shameful, he says. Cowardly. He'd rather die than admit he needs rescue. So the rearguard fights alone. 20,000 Franks against 400,000 Saracens. They kill enemies by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, in combat that defies all logic and reason. Roland personally slays more men than seems humanly possible. And still they lose. Still they're overwhelmed. Still, one by one, the Franks fall. Only at the very end, when almost everyone is dead, when Roland himself is dying from his wounds, does he finally blow the horn. The sound carries for 30 leagues. Charlemagne hears it and races back. But he's too late. Roland dies before help arrives. He dies facing the enemy, his sword Durandal beneath him so no pagan can claim it. His face toward Spain, toward the land he tried to conquer for God. A perfect death, a martyr's death, a hero's death. None of it historical, all of it unforgettable. The Song of Roland doesn't just embellish history. It replaces it. After 1100, when people thought of Roncesvalles, they didn't think of Einhard's terse paragraph. They thought of Roland's horn echoing through the mountains. They thought of 20,000 martyrs dying for Christ. They thought of Ganelon's treachery and Charlemagne's grief, and the final terrible moment when the greatest warrior in Christendom breathed his last. The poem was performed at courts across Europe. Knights memorized it. Crusaders carried it to the Holy Land. At the Battle of Hastings in 1066, according to one chronicle, a Norman minstrel sang verses from the Song of Roland to inspire the troops before the charge. The legend became more real than reality. But here's what gets lost in all that poetry: the actual sacrifice. In the Song of Roland, the hero dies because he's too proud to call for help. His death is glorious, but also kind of his fault. If he'd blown the horn earlier, Charlemagne could have saved them. Roland's stubbornness kills 20,000 men. That's a great dramatic conflict. Pride versus survival. Honor versus pragmatism. But it's not what happened. In reality, there was no horn to blow. No army 30 leagues away waiting to rescue them. Charlemagne was already gone, already over the mountain, already beyond any possibility of return. The rearguard wasn't doomed by Roland's pride. They were doomed by geography, and they held anyway. The real Roland, whoever he was, didn't die because he refused help. He died because help wasn't coming. He stood his ground not out of stubbornness, but out of duty, because someone had to, because if the rearguard broke, everyone died. That's not as dramatic as the poem. There's no tragic flaw, no fatal pride, no moment where a different choice could have saved everyone. There's just a man doing his job, holding the line, buying time with his life so that others could escape. The Song of Roland turned that quiet sacrifice into spectacular drama, but in doing so, it obscured something important. Real heroism isn't always loud. It isn't always glorious. Sometimes it's just refusing to run when running would be easier. Sometimes it's dying in a mountain pass for an army that doesn't even know you're in danger. Sometimes heroism looks like failure. We'll never know what Roland actually thought in his final moments. We'll never know if he was brave or terrified, defiant or resigned. The historical record is silent. The man behind the legend is gone forever. But we know what he did. He stayed. When staying meant death, when escape was impossible but surrender was still an option, when every instinct must have screamed at him to flee, he stayed. The Basques offered no quarter. There was no chance of survival. Roland could have run into the mountains, could have abandoned his men, could have tried to disappear into the chaos. He didn't. He stood with his soldiers. He fought beside them. He died among them. And because he did, Charlemagne's army survived. The Song of Roland is a masterpiece, one of the greatest works of medieval literature. It deserves every bit of its fame. But it's not history. And the history, the real history, deserves to be remembered too. Not because it's more dramatic, it isn't. Not because it has better characters, it doesn't. But because the truth matters. Because real sacrifice matters. Because the men who died at Roncesvalles deserve to be remembered for what they actually did, not just for what poets imagined they did. They held a pass against impossible odds. They bought time for an army to escape. They died doing their duty. No magic swords, no 100-league horns, no 400,000 Saracens, just soldiers, just mountains, just death. So what do we actually know? After all the legends, after all the poetry, after 1,000 years of myth, what can we say for certain about what happened on August 15th, 778? Not much. And maybe that's fitting. We know Charlemagne, crossed the Pyrenees with a great army. We know the campaign failed. We know the rearguard was ambushed on the return journey. We know the attackers were Basques or Gascons, local mountain people, not Saracen armies. We know the baggage train was lost. We know 3 elite commanders died: Roland, Egihard, Anselm. We know the attackers escaped into the mountains, unpursued, unpunished. Everything else? Speculation, educated guesses, gaps filled by imagination. We don't know how many Franks died. The 20,000 of the Song of Roland is fantasy. The 900 mentioned in some later chronicles is probably also invented. The truth is lost. Maybe hundreds, maybe dozens. Enough to matter. Enough to haunt Charlemagne for the rest of his reign. We don't know exactly where the ambush happened. Roncesvalles? The pass of Ibaneta? Somewhere else entirely? Historians argue. The mountains keep their secrets. We don't know how long the battle lasted. Minutes? Hours? Did the rearguard make a fighting retreat, or were they overwhelmed in a single devastating assault? No one recorded it. No one who knew survived to tell. We don't even know if Roland really commanded the rearguard or if he was just the most famous name among the dead. Einhard lists him third, after Egihard and Anselm. Maybe they were in charge. Maybe Roland was simply the one history chose to remember. And yet, despite all these gaps, despite all this uncertainty, something real happened in that pass. Real men fought. Real men died. A real empire trembled. That's not nothing. The legend of Roland has overshadowed the history for so long that we sometimes forget. There was a history. Before the poets got hold of it, before the Saracens replaced the Basques, before the magic sword and the enchanted horn, there was just a battle. A desperate, brutal, anonymous battle in the mountains. Men we'll never know fought enemies we'll never identify in a place we can't quite locate. And they lost. But their loss meant something. Here's the brutal truth about rearguards. They exist to be sacrificed. Every military commander knows this. When an army retreats, someone has to be last. Someone has to face the pursuing enemy while everyone else escapes. Someone has to absorb the blow. The men chosen for that duty understand their role. They're not stupid. They know they're being placed in danger so others can reach safety. They know the math. And they do it anyway. Because that's what soldiers do. Because duty matters. Because sometimes the best you can do is buy time, minutes, hours, whatever you can, and trust that your sacrifice won't be wasted. Roland's rearguard bought time. Maybe only an hour. Maybe only the few minutes it took for the Basque attack to spend itself against Frankish armor and Frankish swords. But it was enough. The main army escaped. Charlemagne escaped. The Frankish Empire survived to become the foundation of medieval Europe. All because someone stayed behind. Urduf, Song of Roland, transformed that sacrifice into something else, something grander, more dramatic, more memorable. In the poem, Roland's death is spectacular, supernatural. The earth shakes, the sky darkens, angels descend to carry his soul to paradise. Charlemagne returns with his army and annihilates the Saracens in a battle of apocalyptic revenge. It's magnificent storytelling. It's also a kind of compensation. Because the truth is, there was no revenge, no triumphant counterattack, no justice for the fallen. The Basques vanished into their mountains and lived out their lives in peace. Charlemagne never punished them. He couldn't. The poem gives us the ending history denied. It lets us imagine that Roland's death meant something cosmic, that God himself took notice, that the scales were balanced in the end. But they weren't. In reality, the dead stayed dead. The killers went free. The empire moved on. That's not a satisfying ending. That's not how stories are supposed to work. But it's how history works, all the time, over and over. Why does Roncesvalles still matter? 1,200 years have passed. The Frankish Empire is dust. The Pyrenees are crossed by highways now, not army columns. The Basques have their own autonomous region, their own language, their own identity. No longer mountain raiders, but European citizens. So why do we still tell this story? Because it's true, in the deepest sense. Not the Song of Roland, not the Saracens and the magic horn and the 400,000 enemies. That's fantasy. But the core of it, the sacrifice, the duty, the men who stayed behind, that's true. That's always true. In every war, in every retreat, in every desperate moment when someone has to hold the line. Roncesvalles isn't just a medieval battle. It's an archetype, a template, the story of everyone who ever stood in the gap knowing they wouldn't survive it. Think about the last moments. The sun is setting over the Pyrenees. The shadows are long. The air smells like blood and pine and fear. Roland, or whoever commanded that rearguard, looks around at his men. They're exhausted, wounded, dying. The Basques are still coming, still throwing javelins from the rocks above, still picking off anyone who shows themselves. There's no way out, no rescue coming, no hope. But the road behind them is clear. The baggage train is gone, lost to the enemy. But the main army is safe, miles away, already descending the northern slopes. It worked. The sacrifice worked. Roland doesn't know if history will remember him. He doesn't know that poets will sing his name for centuries. He doesn't know that his death will inspire crusaders and knights and ordinary people for 1,000 years. All he knows is that his men are dying, that he's dying, that the sun is going down and soon it will be over. Does he feel pride, despair, peace? We'll never know. The mountains don't tell us. History doesn't tell us. But I like to think, and maybe this is my own, legend-making, my own poetry, that in those final moments he understood. He understood that this was enough, that holding the line, even for an hour, even against impossible odds, even in a battle no one would ever describe accurately, that was enough. Not victory, not glory, just duty, fulfilled to the end. One pass, one rearguard, and an empire that kept moving because someone stayed behind. That's the truth of Roncesvalles. Not the legend, not the poem, not the Saracens or the horn or the sword that could cut through marble, just the truth. Men died in those mountains. They died so others could live. They died doing what soldiers have always done, standing between danger and the people they protect. The Song of Roland made them immortal. But they were already heroes. They just needed a poet to remind us. August 15th, 778. The sun sets over the Pyrenees. The last Frankish soldier falls, and somewhere on the road to Francia, an army marches on, never knowing, until it's far, too late, what it cost to keep them safe. This was Roncesvalles. This is what sacrifice looks like. Remember it.